Well, now that we've talked about PyCharm and a little bit about Python, we go straight into syntax. Now, the most important thing at a very fundamental level in Python would be variables. And when you work with variables, you'll understand that Python is very different from mathematics. In mathematics, you would have a linear equation, for example, that says y is equal to 10x plus 2. And that makes sense because as the value of x changes, the value of y changes. But in programming, you can have something like x is equal to x plus 1. Now, from a mathematical standpoint, that makes no sense because how can x be the same as x plus 1? How can 1 be equal to 2 and 2 be equal to 3? And that goes on for all numbers infinitely, right? So what Python does is that Python is a line-by-line interpreter. So that means that if in line 1, the value of x is 1, and if in line 2, the value of x is 2, for the third line, the value of x will always be 2. It forgets the first value as it gets a new value. So when we say x is equal to x plus 1, it's just storing the value of x plus 1 to a new variable called x, and it forgets the value that x originally had in it. So that's the difference between math and programming. And this is why learning syntax can be a little uncomfortable, but this is much easier than what you would see in something like C or Java, believe me. So it's a simple question. If a is equal to 1, then what would a is equal to a plus 1 be? So what's the new value of a? So that would be 2. Now, a lot of times you'd be manipulating a variable and you would have it go through like a rigorous amount of manipulations. And you would not want to use that variable for as an input to a new function or something else, because that thing is already going under so many manipulations. You don't want your program to mess up someplace. So what you do is that you alias the variable. So what you do is if a is equal to a plus 1, you just create b is equal to a. So whatever value a has at the end, b is going to have that value. And that's a very, very good way to do this. Variables have a few rules, and these are really, really important. And frankly, like I took this class at UCSD where they taught me this. Otherwise, like this is something that's so precious, but like you'll not find this anywhere. So really pay attention. When you're defining variables, the name is always on the left, and the value that variable is going to store is always on the right. So make sure if you want to store the value inside a, the a has to be on the left, and on the right of the equal to sign would be all the value that you want to store inside it. The name that you give to a variable is going to be case sensitive. The variable can be named A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z. It can be named Knuckle. It can be named ACID Education. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it Macintosh. It doesn't matter. Python does not care what you name the variable, because at the end of the day, it's just going to convert that into machine language, and at the end of the day, it's just binary, so that it can undergo NAND and all those like logic gate operations. But for humans, names really matter. So it's really important that whatever the kind of data you're storing inside the variable, you have the variable name related to that, so that if other people are looking at your code, it's much more convenient for them. A variable is not supposed to have any special characters in it, so no asterisk and hashtag, nothing. In fact, a hashtag is only used if you're trying to comment. So if you want the interpreter to ignore some code, you're going to put a hashtag and a space bar and then write whatever you want, and that's just going to be ignored. So that's just for your reference to tell yourself what's this piece of code about. So all this gray text that you see on the screen right now, that's just comments, and that's why if I run this program, Python will just ignore this. It is case sensitive, so if you want to call a variable later and the first letter of that variable or the second letter is uppercase, if you're calling that variable, you need to make sure that you write it the exact same way. That's pretty much it. Yeah, that's where variables go. But the most important thing is that a variable has a type. So when you're programming in other programming languages, usually you have to define what the type is. For example, variable a is equal to 1 would not work. You have to say that variable a is going to be an integer, and that integer is 1. So you have to define that pre-hand. That's what I noticed in C#. And you can always ask Python what type of variable this is by just writing type, putting parentheses, and that variable inside. So this type is actually a function that someone really smart in Python defined long ago. And inside that function, we're just giving a variable, and then that function type is just checking what variable it is. So we will learn how to define our own functions, make our own functions, and give it some input data. So if you're wondering why we put in parentheses and why do we write the variable a in it, is because this function type is expecting some data, right? What do you want it to check? So that's why inside the parentheses you always have to put something when you're using type. Or that's the same thing with print. So print would show something on the screen below. So you always have to give it some input. We'll talk much more about functions right now, but if you were confused why this format is used, that's just the reason. And type is just a function. So let's run this. So you would see that, okay, give me one sec. Let's move this to a new Scratch file. Awesome. You see how convenient Python is? Like, you guys get what I'm talking about? Anyway. Right, we have to print this. So it's a class integer. It says that automatically. Now what about 1.01? What would that be? Now that's a float. So integers and floats are different. Integers are unsigned and they can't have anything after the decimal place. A float can be signed and have decimal point numbers in it. Now a string is literally a string of characters. There can be any characters, special characters, alphabets, uppercase, anything. It's just a string. There can even be numbers inside them. And the way you begin the string and end the string is by putting an apostrophe. That's how Python knows that what you're going to put is a string. So strings store characters as text. So string A over here is equal to apostrophe words, comma, space words, comma, space words, and then apostrophe. So that's the string. Now string B is an apostrophe, then a space bar, and then an apostrophe. String C is just more words with a full stop at the end. Now the question is, can I add strings? Now I know that if you do variable A is equal to 1 and then you define variable B is equal to 2, and then you add variable 1 and variable 2, you're going to get 3 because an integer can be added. But can strings be added? Well, apparently they can. So string D, which is equal to string A plus string B plus string C, is just words, comma, words, comma, words, and more words. So there's a space bar between these two strings because of string B. And then another type of data is called a Boolean. Now Boolean might not seem really important when you just start programming, but with time it's probably going to be one of the most important things to you because it really reduces the amount of code you have to write for something. While you're writing for loops and while loops, you want to get out of those loops, right? Like once you've done this 40 times or once this value is big enough, you want to break out of that loop. So if this is true, then break out of the loop. If this is false, then break out of the loop. So you can give variables true and false, and if A is equal to true, then just break, right? So we can actually use Booleans to really reduce the amount of work we have to do. And sometimes like there's no way to go around it, you have to use Booleans. None is a special type. It's not exactly 0. So if A is equal to none and Y is equal to 2, I can't add A and Y. That's because they have two different data types. And you can never add two different data types. So if I want to add string underscore C with the number 5, the integer 5, I cannot do that. My program will tell me that there is a type error. I can only add an integer to an integer, a string to a string. So if I want to add 5 to it, I'll have to convert 5 into a string by putting apostrophe around it. That's just some basics of variables. Now that we know this, we'll go straight into functions and start writing some real code.